Welcome back to the second part of my lore breakdown of episode 1 of my own Second Age series. Let's jump back to the story and continue where we came from. Scene 5. We cut to the spring of 725 and we are at Romana where Aldarion and Vëantur set sail. The first thing we see is Aldarion handing a bow of voyage to Father Vëantur. Voyage is a type of tree that grows especially in the western parts of Númenor, known as Nismaldar. Nismaldar is the country around Lindon. This type of tree, along with the melon trees, or Lindon in plural form, were given to the Númenorians by the Eldar, but we will get back to that region later on in the story. But all you should know here is that it was customary among Númenorian mariners to place a cut bow of voyage on the prows of their ship, called the Green Bow of Return, as a symbol of good fortune. It will come back into the story later on, but this is also a bit of foreshadowing, as we will also see what happens if you set sail without it. As Aldarion says, may it spare you from the wrath of Ose. Ose is a Maya and servant of Ulmo. Ose loves the winds and prefers the coast and isles of Middle-earth. Ose is a kind of an unpredictable Maya. The mariners of Númenor did honor him, but they did not trust him because of his unpredictable temperament. There's some darkness and violence in his spirit, as he had once served Melkor, and also still enjoyed raging in storms, despite the will of Ulmo. Only his spouse Uinen could restrain his wild spirit, and Uinen was even more loved by the mariners, but she will also come into the story later on. Last thing in this scene I want to elaborate on is the fact that Galdo is the first to turn away. Again, a bit of foreshadowing, that he doesn't actually approve of Aldarion sailing to Middle-earth, and it's one of the main conflicts in this season. It's not an epic battle or anything, but I do think it will be interesting anyway. In this scene we're first introduced to the three mariners on board the ship, Oronwe, Ulbar and Hendirk. Ulbar and Hendirk are actually from the lore, but are first mentioned later in Aldarion's life. They were probably not on board the first voyage, as their lives most likely were shorter. Friendship is a big thing in Tolkien's works, and also why it should play a part even early on. Oronwe is a character I've added myself, but there's actually some lore behind it. He is a Númenorian named after the elven mariner from Gondolin. There's a number of reasons why I've chosen this elf as inspiration for the character, but I don't want to spoil too much at this point. Next we also see Aldarion and Vëantur look back and see Númenor sink in the horizon. This is from the Unfinished Tales, as I also mentioned in the recap. I do talk more about it in the recap, so feel free to check it out. Next Vëantur explains what happened last time he went to Middle-earth. During the first visit, Vëantur became acquainted with Círdan and High King Gil-galad. Together they journeyed to the Tower Hills, where they met with 12 men from Eriador, who came to see those who had returned from death in the deeps of the sea. It said that there were some difficulties understanding each other's languages. They did end on friendly terms though, but if you know the history of Aldarion, you'll know he wasn't exactly on friendly terms with all the men of Middle-earth, and we will explore that in a later episode. So in the next scene we see Aldarion write in his notebook, and one of the mariners spot land. As I mentioned in the recap, the world is actually flat, so they wouldn't actually see the top of the mountains, but instead the entire mountain chain would slowly become more visible. As they sail into the havens of Mithlond, Círdan is already waiting, and that may seem odd to people, but Círdan actually had the gift of foresight, as he also explains to Aldarion. That is of course from the lore, though it's not stated that Círdan knew Aldarion would arrive, but it will be quite important in the story. The line, "Hail and well met at last," is actually inspired by how Galdo and Glorian reads Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring. So again I've tried to use the books as inspiration for how elves would talk, while also trying to come up with some original dialogue. There's also a tiny little lore detail I've also included in this meeting between Círdan and Aldarion. He bows his head slightly and holds his hand upon the breast. This is actually how Gondorians greeted each other, and how they greet Pippin in the streets of Minas Tirith. That felt as a nice little detail. They might have gotten that from their ancestors, the Númenorians. Hendirk spots one of the elf maidens, and this is a minor setup for something that will be explained in the next episode. As the mariners are led to the Hall of Gil-galad, we find him standing next to an elf called Pengoloth. Pengoloth was a lawmaster that had lived in Gondolin. His father was an Aldarion lord, while his mother was a Sindarin lady. I don't want to spoil too much about him for those that don't know him, but he will play a minor role in the coming seasons, and is quite an interesting character under Gil-galad's command. I also introduced something very similar to what is introduced in the Rings of Power, that elves have a different sense of time than mortals, even Númenorians that have a very long life compared to normal men. I think it's important to point out that the elves are immortal and feel differently because of that. I've also used a line from the Lament of the Rohirrim. In the book it's said by Aragorn, but you will probably remember it from Theoden in the films before the Battle of Helm's Deep. Featured in the scene is also Galdo. He too is from the lore. During the Council of Elrond, Círdan did not attend, but instead sent Galdo. He was the elf that asked about what proof there were that the Ring of Frodo was indeed the One Ring, and also inquired why Saruman was not with them. Gandalf answered his questions, narrating his story and how he discovered the One Ring, and about Saruman's treachery. Later during the council, Galdo mentioned that he knew the figure of Iarwain, or Tom Bombadil, as you might know him, and he agreed with Glorfindel that Tom Bombadil had not the power to defy Sauron and keep the One Ring from himself. So I think he's a somewhat semi-important elf from the books, but it's not mentioned what he was doing in the Second Age, if he was even born. Still, I thought it was interesting to give him a role in this show. And speaking about Tom Bombadil, yes, he will be featured as well. And that is why Glorfindel and Galdo actually know him a little. I don't want to spoil anything, but he will first come into play in a later season. We cut to Círdan leading Aldarion towards Elrond's house in Lindon. The purpose of this whole scene is to convey Aldarion's interest in shipbuilding and how Círdan would be the best to learn from. It's the beginning of the friendship between them. The next scene is with the Council. It has some similarities to the Council of Elrond and the White Council in The Hobbit, so let's discuss who's present first. We have two unnamed lords from Lindon, the Lord of Harlindon and Forlindon. These are mainly there because it would make logical sense. Then of course Gil-galad. Círdan shows up later on. He is mainly there to serve as an advisor. Fingolorth, one of the greatest lawmasters of the elves, also an important advisor. Then there's Celeborn and Galadriel, Lord and Lady of the elves living by the lake Nenuyil. It's not said when they moved to live by the lake, but it's quite certain they lived there around 725. This is only 25 years before the founding of Eregion. With them they've also brought Celebrimbor, the grandson of Fëanor. The last elf is Oropher, a Sindel living under Celeborn and Galadriel. He's going to be a friend of Celeborn in this show, and if you're unaware who he is the father of Thranduil. Thranduil will also play a minor part in the show, and we will actually meet him in episode 2. So let's try and walk through the dialogue chronologically. There's quite a bit to talk about. First, Amdir is mentioned, and how he doesn't want to seem to make an alliance with Gil-galad. It's a bit of a comment on his passive role in the Second Age, and he only seems to have helped when it really mattered. His son Amroth is quite different though, but Amdir himself first helped in the War of the Last Alliance. So I guess you could say it's a setup for his story. First he refuses to see the threat of Sauron, then the war in Eregion occurs in a later season, and it becomes clear that they will need to stand together against Sauron, and last year in season 5 he will join the alliance and fight Sauron, and sadly die. Both Gil-galad and Galadriel seem aware about the growing evil out there. Galadriel describes it as a residue of evil, which is the exact same words used in the Unfinished Tales. And likewise we know from the lore that Gil-galad was aware that some sort of evil was out there, but with the help of Aldarion, he realized it's Sauron. So that's what this season is going to be about, hunting for the servants of Morgoth and realizing it's Sauron who's behind the growing shadow. But as I've said many times now, Sauron will not be the only villain in this story. Describing the Misty Mountains as a shield against the evil is also taken from the lore, but said by Gil-galad. So that will become true later in the story and fit the lore very well. Celebrimbor mentions the gap south of Mithethras. Mithethras is the mountain north of Isengard, though Isengard wasn't built at the time. The gap is mainly known as the Gap of Rohan, but it can't be called that as Rohan doesn't exist yet. Near the end of this scene, we also get a hint that Celeborn and Celebrimbor aren't the best of friends, but I'll explain that in detail when we get back to the council. In the next scene we start out with Elrond sitting with his harp and singing a lament of the third kinslaying. The fact he has a silver harp is a minor detail from the lore I decided to include. The lament itself is made by Elaran and translated into Sindarin. In case you don't know, the third kinslaying is the reason why Elrond and his brother Elros became orphans. So not only is it very personal for Elrond, but it actually also connects to the scene as Aldarion shows up, the descendant of Elros, and also Elrond's first encounter with the descendant of Elros. It's possible this also occurred lore-wise, though it's not mentioned, that Elrond and Aldarion ever met. But it is quite certain that Elrond never went to Númenor, and if he did, it's never mentioned at least. There's going to be a bond and friendship between Aldarion and Elrond. We know from the lore that the heirs of Isildur often grew up in Rivendell later on, and Elrond sort of become a second father to many of the Dunedain. This friendship between the Dunedain and Elrond will also be something I dive into with Isildur and Elrond. So this first friendship between Elrond and Aldarion will mirror that of Isildur and Elrond later on, but will of course have differences. I hope it will make the whole ending more emotional. I felt it made for some better storytelling, but time will tell. So the purpose of the scene was for Aldarion and Elrond to meet, and since Elrond is a lawmaster, it makes sense he will teach him many things about Middle-earth. Back to the council. We start out with Gil-galad responding to Galadriel's comment about the Númenorians inspiring hope. Gil-galad's response is very inspired by Elrond's comment about men in the films. Men are weak, as he says to Gandalf, and likewise, easily corrupted, is what Galadriel says in the voiceover in the first film. But it also foreshadows certain things. Yes, men are weak and will fall to the shadow. And here I'm not talking only about the Númenorians, but also the men that will accept the rings of power, and also how Isildur fails to destroy the One Ring in the end. He continues and talks about how none of the Númenorians at this point are true warriors. This is true, but will change in this season. And in the later seasons they will be the famous warriors you all probably remember. The conversation goes on, and they start talking about forging new alliances. And that is the topic for episode 2, potential allies for the elves. Gil-galad also mentions that he will not blindly follow the advice of men like his father did. This is a reference to Ordredreth and how he listened to Turin, which led to the downfall of Nargothrond. I also mentioned this in the recap. Some of you might think Gil-galad was the son of Fingon, or perhaps Finrod Felagund, but Tolkien's final decision was to make him the son of Ordredreth, so that's what I'm going with. Pengoloth replies to Gil-galad's comment, basically blaming Turin for the fall of Nargothrond. It is a bit more complicated than that. Turin was cursed after all, and Pengoloth believes it was the curse that brought down the kingdom and not Turin himself. Galadriel then suggests to ally the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. This is also from the Unfinished Tales. The whole council thing is an invention of my own, with many bits of lore mixed together. There are 2 different reasons why Eregion was founded, depending on the text you read. In one version it's to ally the dwarves, and in the other it's because of Mithril. I've tried to include both, and I'll do similar things with the lore if there are different versions. Celeborn thinks it's folly to trust the dwarves. He has a deep hatred to them after their attack on Doriath, and for good reason. This hatred to the dwarves is a big part of his character, and also something we see in The Lord of the Rings. In a later episode, we will get into this again, and learn more about it, and why Celeborn continues to harbour such a hatred for dwarves. Orofir is also an elf from Doriath, and agrees with Celeborn. Orofir also questions Celebrimbor's involvement with the second kinslaying in Doriath that led to the death of Dior, son of Thingol. Lore-wise, Celebrimbor didn't actually take part in this, but we don't know about his whereabouts, and neither does Orofir. The whole reason I've added this is to talk about different perspectives on the sins of the father mentality, and I also talk about this in the recap. Celebrimbor suggests to set up a colony right next to Khazad-dûm. This will of course be Eregion. In this version, it's not yet known that the dwarves have found Mithril, but it will be the reason why some of the Noldor will settle in Eregion, but also why some of the other types of elves refuse to follow them, and we will see some of that happen in the coming episodes. Pengoloth asks if he can go with Celebrimbor and is granted leave. From the lore we know that Pengoloth was one of the few elves allowed into Khazad-dûm, and the lore even states he might have learned Kustal, the language of the dwarves, so that's actually why he's going with Celebrimbor. In the scene with Elrond and Aldarion, the purpose was to give an idea that the servants of Morgoth are still out there. Ungoliant's fate is also unknown, at least in this series, so it's a setup for what to come. Ungoliant herself won't actually be in the show however, but they will try to find her. At the docks at Greyhavens, we learn that the Númenorians plan to return in a couple of months. From Aldarion's perspective, it seems like only a matter of time before he is forced to return to Númenor and never return to Middle-earth. Gil-galad invites him to come with him to the Grey Hills, which are the hills that would later be known as the Tower Hills. We know they weren't called the Tower Hills at this point, especially since the towers aren't built yet. The towers will be built near the end of the Second Age. so we will get back to that in Season 5. So this scene is also to mirror and connect between Gil-galad and Elendil. And then we have a minor scene with Pengoloth and Celebrimbor. The point of this scene is to indicate what is coming in episode 2. And we learned that they are not planning to head for Khazad-dûm right away, but instead plan to head for Ered Luin. So expect to see that in episode 2. Back to the Grey Hills. Voronwe remarks that it's a fair sight over Grey Havens and the lands to the west, even for a Númenorian that have walked beneath the trees of Nizimaldar. That's the forest I mentioned earlier near Vëantur. The whole purpose of this scene is to draw parallels between Gil-galad and his friendship with Elendil and Aldarion. So we will get back here in Season 5 and see the towers being built and one of the Palantiri being placed in one of the towers. I've also used a line from The Lord of the Rings by Gandalf. Gil-galad says, "Not even the very wise knows where it ends," about Middle-earth, which sounds pretty similar to Gandalf's line in The Lord of the Rings. You probably remember this line from the films as well. It's actually a bit of a comment about the map and how little we know about the world outside of northwestern Middle-earth. They also mention how Círdan is fated to remain in Middle-earth and help the Eldar reach the Undying Lands. It only felt right, and also makes it a little easier to understand why Círdan is not travelling with Aldarion on his many voyages. It's rather limited what we know about Gil-galad, as some of you know, and I wanted to include something from the song The Fall of Gil-galad. And we have the line, "The last whose realm was fair and free, between the mountains and the sea," which I tried to use in the scene as well. It's a minor lore detail, but I felt it was a neat little thing to include. Next we have the dining scene, where Aldarion and Gil-galad talk with each other. It's simply there to indicate that time progresses, and the friendship between them grows stronger. Next we have the montage, where Aldarion is still learning about ships and shipbuilding. It's said this was the main reason why he delayed his return to Númenor, and we also see his friendship with Círdan and Gil-galad grow. Having him stay in Mithlond to learn about shipbuilding also justifies what he can do later in the story. And then to the last scene. Aldarion is on board the ship, Númenor, still taking notes in his book. The most important thing I want to highlight is the speech. First off, I will say it's very inspired by the quote from Altharian's story in the Unfinished Tales. Not the actual content of the speech so much, but rather the mindset. The speech is there to foreshadow the glory of Númenor, but also how the ambitions and dreams of one man can change the course of history. And that exact way of thinking actually reminded me of Alexander the Great. It may seem a bit far-fetched to some, but the idea of dreaming beyond boundaries in pursuit of endless glory is what I'm grasping at. So if you look at it from that perspective, it might be easier to follow. Alexander the Great and Aldarion are still very different characters, of course, but I do think they share some similarities. Maybe you can see it as well when the story continues. Before we wrap up, I want to discuss some of the things Aldarion mentioned in his speech. He mentions that they could go to lands no one has ever seen before. This is a vague reference to the Dark Land, the continent south of Middle-earth, that we know very little about. There's a fine little piece of lore woven into the speech. And likewise, Aldarion mentions the Gate of Morning, which is said to have been seen by some mariners that sailed as far east as east goes. As I've mentioned, the Earth is flat in the Second Age, so the Gate of Morning is where the sun rises. We don't know much about it, sadly, but I decided to include it. First because it turns out to be true in the lore, though it's not associated with Aldarion directly, just great Númenorian mariners. And secondly, because it highlights the ambition of Aldarion and his dreams, to set out to do the impossible and do what no one else before him have ever done. I hope that makes him appealing to some viewers at least, and that they too are curious to discover Middle-earth, along with this young man. Lastly, I want to point out that I could go on and try to explain how I've used the hero's journey for this season. The hero's journey is a very common pattern used for the protagonist in films. You can actually apply it to the vast majority of films. Also in certain cases, some films can be a little hollow if they skip some of these steps. I think Rey's story in The Force Awakens is a fine example on how not to do it. Anyway, I've tried to make Aldarion's story fit with the hero's journey, but it will take some time to explain, so instead I think we should discover it together. And that was the walkthrough of this first episode. Now this lore breakdown was very long, and I will not do lore breakdowns for the future episodes. Instead I will talk about some of the things in the live stream when season 1 ends. Let me know in the comments if you like the breakdown, and if you want to support the channel, you can become a member, join our Discord, or donate directly with the super thanks function. As always, thank you all for watching. If you haven't watched the recap yet, I highly recommend you to watch it as well. It will not only give you a deeper understanding of episode 1, but the entire season, perhaps even the entire series. Farewell till next time.